Hello, and welcome to a History of Egypt podcast interview episode. My guest today is Professor Peter Brand, who joins us once again to explain the life and reign of Ramesses II. Today, we discuss one of the more famous aspects of the king's rule, his many children. With at least 45 sons and 56 daughters known to history, Ramesses II might be the most prolific pharaoh of all time. Certainly the horniest. But beyond that aspect of it, there's a few lingering questions. Number one, what did all of these children actually do? How did they fit into the wider Egyptian society? Also, what's up with Ramesses marrying his own daughters? And finally, if there were 100 children, where are all of them buried? Professor Brand explores these and other questions as we continue our discussion of the life of Ramesses II. I hope you enjoy. So, Peter, moving now to the sons and daughters of Ramesses II. One of the famous parts of his reign is the sheer number of children whom he and his two primary wives and presumably other women produce. Notably, though, Ramesses really promotes his children visibly in art on the walls of temples. He gives the sons at least their own massive tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Many of the daughters get individual tombs in the Valley of the Queens. At least from an iconography perspective, it seems that his children are far more visible and prominent than earlier rulers had mostly done. Why do you think he emphasizes this aspect of his family and court so strongly?
Well, it's an interesting question. Of course, it's hard to know what was particularly running through his mind when he does this. But there's a couple of observations we can make. First of all, this is highly unusual. And in fact, it begs the question that is Ramses unusual in having so many children, or is he unusual in displaying them on the monuments so that we have so much information about them? And I think it's actually the latter, because we do have indications in different periods that kings could have large numbers of children. So, for instance, during the 18th dynasty, where you don't see the sons and daughters of other kings on royal monuments, for instance, during the Tutmosid period, we know of any number of royal sons because they are depicted on the walls of the tombs of, if you will, their tutors, their male tutors, or the female court women, often known as wet nurses or nannies, that took care of these children. But they are never shown on the monuments of their royal father. And then, of course, there was a recently discovered tomb from the Valley of the Kings, discovered by a Swiss Egyptologist, Susan Bickel, that included the remains of dozens of individuals, some of them being royal wives, presumably minor royal wives, but many of them including the bones of what appear to be royal children, male and female. And so I think it's really the case that Ramses does make this essentially unprecedented decision to display his royal children on the monuments. And in the case of royal sons, he's taking something of a risk, because other kings, there was a reason why they don't display their sons, even the crown prince. In fact, perhaps even especially the crown prince, are rarely shown on royal monuments, because any royal male, be he a son, a brother, in fact, especially a brother, or even other male kin, are a potential threat to his power as a kind of rival, which is, even in contemporary literature of the Ramesside period, you have cases like the tale of the two brothers, the Horus and Seth, who of course are uncle and nephew, but are also cast almost as if they're brothers. There are almost no examples throughout Egyptian history where brothers are shown. And again, even with crown princes, it's relatively few and far between that we know about the successors of the pharaoh on monuments of these actual pharaohs themselves. And the ultimate example, I think, is that the British Egyptologist Aidan Dodson compiled a list of all the known princes, royal sons, either crown princes or sort of the junior princes of the entire 18th dynasty. And across the entire 18th dynasty, based on inscriptional and statuary evidence with the names of these princes, we actually know of fewer princes of the entire 18th dynasty than we know of sons of Ramses II, which is extraordinary. So why is this? Why does Ramses do this? And ultimately, I would say it's all about him. That this is another example of a strategy that Ramses uses to promote his own kingship ideology. And very much like his wives, the royal children are a demonstration of his fertility, of his masculine power, and so just simply having lots of children, is something that all kings do as a demonstration of their power and fertility. And the king himself represents the fertility of Egypt. Having lots of wives and lots of children is a demonstration of royal power and prestige. And so by advertising the fact only heightens the prestige of the king. And I think it becomes a stand-in uh, for his demonstrating his fertility, as we'll see when we look at these parades of royal children on the monuments. So again, exactly why he decides to do this is up for perhaps debate, but I think overall it's a question of royal prestige. Although you could argue that he's taking something of a risk here
Mm.
by setting up at least the elder children as potential rivals um, by doing this. But of course, he seems to have succeeded spectacularly.
Thinking about the sort of family dynamics aspect from a political perspective, do you think there's any element of perhaps by displaying these children, the sheer number of them, almost reassuring any courtier or political group who is looking that the dynastic collapse of that late 18th dynasty is not going to happen again on his watch, that it's sort of like a communication of we're fine, we have plenty of heirs and spares, don't worry about that?
Yes, I do. I mean, there's a couple of sort of intertwined, I think, motivations for the crown prince here. Because I mean, one thing, I don't think there was a co-regency. I don't think Ramses became pharaoh until Seti died. But even as crown prince, he's being established with, if you will, a starter royal family that includes polygamy of multiple wives, and that they get busy producing multiple children in what I like to describe as a baby race, with Nefertari coming in first by producing the first viable male son, Amenhotep, and the second place going to Nofret, who produces the second male son. I mean, the second viable male child, Ramses Jr. And we have to remember, too, there may have been other women who became pregnant with children that died in infancy or were stillborn, or there were miscarriages, that had their sons only lived, that they would have become the bearers of the firstborn son. But if you, I'd like to say that, sort of like Harry Potter, Amenhotep was the boy who lived. Now, again, I can't prove that. I'm not saying for sure that Amenhotep would have had some deceased elder brother who simply did not survive. But be that as it may, it seems that any number of children were born during the time of Ramses still being a crown prince, and that the necessity for him to essentially produce lots of children by multiple wives is something they did not wait for him to ascend the throne.
Mm.
We have no idea whether Ramses had younger brothers, but Seti decided that he was hell bent that Ramses, as crown prince, would have as many children by a multiple number of wives as quickly as possible, to sort of reestablish the normal pattern of a dynasty, to get him going, as I say, in the business of being a family man.
And in The Ultimate Pharaoh, you give a list of the known sons and the known daughters in rough order, and we have, at least in the book, we have 44 named sons and 56 named daughters, which gives us the suspiciously round figure of 100 children. People probably know the names like Kai Mwasit, maybe Amun-Her Kopeshef, possibly one or two of the others, Merneptah, obviously. But we have this vast list of miscellaneous children who might, in some cases, merely be names on a list on a temple wall with no other information. For these non-participatory sons, the ones who are not holding any high office, what kind of lifestyle do you see them having? Do you think they would be cloistered in some royal apartment palace somewhere, or would they perhaps be left to their own devices to participate in Egyptian society?
Well, it's one of those questions that, quite frankly, is very hard, if not impossible, to answer. And we'll get back later, perhaps, in terms of the so-called careers of royal sons. And we do know of adult royal sons, and this includes some of the more junior sons, that had particular jobs in the lower ranks of the administration, not, the big jobs like vizier or overseer of the treasury, but there was one of the junior sons who was in charge of a temple estate, or even one of the royal temple estates. It's quite possible that some of these, if not all of these royal sons, sort of had sort of lower ranking administrative positions uh, in some local post, like, managing a royal estate or that kind of thing.
Hmm.
It's surprising because, again, you would imagine that, having all these children, the Pharaoh wouldn't want them sitting around the house,
Hmm.
eating up resources, and would want to find them jobs. But really, if you go back really to the Old Kingdom, beginning in the fifth dynasty, where in the fourth dynasty, it seems that high-ranking members of the royal family, not just the sons of the king, but even brothers and uncles, were in the highest levels of the administration, and perhaps saying that this was too much of a threat to royal power.
Hmm.
Beginning in the fifth dynasty, they were sort of kicked out of the high administration and given honorific titles, but stripped of any ability to have their own independent power base. And we'll see that there was only certain possible career titles in the military, and in some cases in the high priesthood for Ramesses' sons, and these tended to go to the highest ranking, most privileged members of his family. But by and large, we know almost nothing about most of the sons, and this is true of the daughters as well. They are just names and images on walls, and their images, of course, as we'll see, are just virtual clones, just sort of cookie cutter images. And in some cases, we have individuals where we don't even have a complete name, because there's only one or two examples on one of these temples, and the inscription is damaged, so you only have part of a name. And this is especially true in some cases of royal daughters.
Hmm.
So again, we almost know nothing about these royal sons.
Fair enough. And moving now, I suppose, to the other half of the equation, which is the daughters. Again, in the book, you're able to list at least 56 clearly identifiable names or individual names. We'll come to a very specific question about the daughter queens in just a moment. But first, I would like to get sort of your perspective on what role these daughters would play within the court and their society, because as far as I'm aware, there's very rarely evidence for them getting married outside the royal family or participating in political life at all. So, what role do you see these daughters playing?
Well, aside from the five daughter wives that marry their father in the second half of the reign, it's even more difficult to find out what they were doing, or what their life consisted of. the only kind of titles that are ever associated with them, and if you will, a kind of practical title, are ones that associate them with temple ritual. There are scenes on some of the temple walls. The best example is probably in Ramses' great forecourt of Luxor Temple, where you have some of the earliest scenes of the processions of sons and daughters. They are depicted as what are known as chantresses. We see them very often. In fact, in most of these, they are shown in procession, and they hold this. On one hand, they usually hold this magical symbol that is a necklace that's associated with, especially with the goddess Hathor, called the Menat collar. In the other hand, upraised, they shake the sistrum, this kind of sacred rattle with these metal pieces that made a kind of tinkling sound that appeased the gods. And among their titles is often this one of a Shemayit, of chantress. And women, especially of the elite, performed these this musical chants as a kind of choir in temple rituals during festivals, and I also suspect during palace ceremonies, and that in fact the ceremonial life at palaces, including these kind of musical rituals with singing and sort of accompanied by musical instruments and dance, was not that far removed from the kind of ceremonies that went on in temples themselves. And as to appease the potential wrath of the king, that the royal women play the sistrum as a way of sort of magically calming down the king's wrath. In fact, the same kind of instrument is still used in the Ethiopian church as a kind of survival of pharaonic times,
Mm.
in Christian ceremony. So this would be the prime way, at least based on the evidence we have, where the rank and file royal daughters would have performed any kind of known purpose other than just simply being royal daughters. Just interestingly, though, presumably in keeping with this statement by Amenhotep III in the Amarna letters, is none of the royal princesses were likely ever sent abroad to marry foreign kings.
Mm.
That sort of taboo against Pharaoh's daughters ever been exchanged in diplomatic marriages was almost certainly upheld during Ramses II's reign.
Speaking of princesses getting married, let's talk about the daughter wives. It's an important part of Ramesses' reign, but it often seems to be one that is misunderstood. I'd like to get it straight from you. What do you understand the role of these daughter marriages to be? Why is he doing this? And is he fathering children with his own daughters?
Well, yes, this is the sort of the elephant in the room. The question of whether these marriages were sexually consummated is sort of the ooh factor, the
Mm.
gross aspect of it. And as I said in the book, for those who would like to think the worst of Ramses as this, old perverted poobah, that of course the fact that he married his daughters and therefore presumably had, intimate relations and God forbid children by them is just, one more example of his perverted nature and megalomania. Although one suspects that some of these critics would somehow conveniently condone or forget that Akhenaten and many of the 18th dynasty pharaohs were doing it with their sisters. And in the case of Akhenaten and Amenhotep III, marrying some of their daughters as well. Yeah, and of course, some people that would wish to preserve the king's honor would deny that these marriages were anything but ceremonial. I personally have no idea whether or not. There's only limited cases of very ambiguous evidence that might be interpreted. There was a small amulet that was once taken as evidence that one of the daughters had a daughter. It's not. And the most clear, if you will, or the most supposedly most telling evidence is in the tomb of the senior daughter wife Bintanoth, where in her tomb she is shown in two scenes with a royal princess standing behind her. This princess is otherwise not named, it seems, as she is given only the title of king's daughter. She is not depicted as a queen. She lacks a royal crown or other royal insignia, but it is instead guised in the manner of a princess. This has been taken as supposedly the smoking gun, that this young princess is she's shown as an adult, not as a little girl, but taken as evidence that she is Bintanoth's daughter sister, if you will.
Mm.
This is the only case of any individual who is shown in any of these tombs that is other than the queen who owns the tomb herself. So again, why is this daughter suddenly appearing next to her alleged mother, and why isn't she named?
Mm.
Well, one scholar that has done work on this makes a very reasonable suggestion that I would endorse, is that in fact what we are seeing is Bintanoth in her aspect of royal princess, standing alongside her aspect of royal wife. And in fact, there are examples in tombs where we see images, multiple images of the tomb owner in different stages of their life. So just because she became queen, she did not cease to be a royal daughter as well. And this is also true in her names and titles. So when we see her names and titles, she is entitled, king's wife and king's daughter.
Mm.
So she preserves her former identity or her original identity as royal daughter while she acquires a new identity as royal wife. And so I think that's what we're actually seeing here. So we should not take these images of this princess as evidence that she is the daughter of Nefertari. Sorry, Bintanoth. She is actually Bintanoth in her role as daughter alongside her queenly self.
Mm.
Again, that still doesn't answer the question or approve that there were no sister daughters, if you will. But if he did produce any children by any of his daughters, we don't have any direct evidence of it.
Fair enough. And for the daughter queens as public figures, do you see the daughters becoming queens in succession, perhaps after their respective mother has died? Or do you think there are multiple of them taking the same title at the same time?
Well, it's hard to put a finger on exactly when some of these daughter wives became essentially married their father in relationship to the lifespan of the two senior queens. I very much suspect that Nofret died before Nefertari.
Mm.
We know that Nefertari was still alive in year 21, shortly after the Hittite peace treaty was signed, because we have these congratulatory letters that were written by members of the court immediately after the treaty. But we also know that she was almost certainly dead by the first Jubilee in year 30, as was her eldest son, Amenhotep. When exactly the daughters, who are again all daughters of these first two senior queens, became queens is a bit ambiguous.
Mm.
They may have only become queens after their mothers had died, or they may have been sort of phased in towards the end of Nefertari's lifetime. Again, it's really hard to say. I suspect that at the very least, it was quite around the time of Nofret's death at the earliest that at least the two senior-most daughter wives, Bintanoth and Married Amen, first married their father. And the question of why they did is, I do think it was as a way of essentially taking over the role that their mothers had played. But I don't think that the two senior queens, daughter wives, Bintanov and married Amun, as sort of replacements, respectively, for Isitnofret and Nefertari, that this was considered just sufficient having these two daughters to replace these two senior queens, because there were these three other daughter wives, Nebet Tawi, Henut Tawi, and Hanut Mire, who again, I think all of them are daughters again of the two original senior queens. So Ramses wanted this larger group of these daughter wives. So it wasn't a one-to-one replacement. And so he has this collection of these senior daughter wives who played the role of senior queens. And in the case of, especially when compared to Isitnofret, their role is even more visible than, at least as they are displayed on the monuments,
Mm.
that Isitnofret ever had been. Because, of course, in the early part of the reign, Nefertari was exclusively depicted as the wife that appeared alongside the king on the monuments. Now, all five of these daughter wives are displayed next to the king on royal statuary, and in some cases, like Bintanov at Abu Simbel, are shown in temple reliefs as well.
So, wrapping up the discussion of the children generally, we have this magnificent tomb, KV5, for the sons. And for several of the daughters, we have individual, discrete tombs in the Valley of the Queens. Do you think there might be a monument equivalent to KV5 for the other unknown daughters?
Yes, but it's KV5.
Okay.
Um, the thing is, there were probably other places where royal children were buried.
Hmm.
There are evidence of burials in uh, in a cemetery outside of this residential palace at the ancient site of Miware in the Fayum,
Hmm.
the so-called harem palace, but again a family quarters, a palace where members of the royal family dwelt. There may have been others associated with other residential palaces for the royal family, at places like Memphis and Ramesses.
Hmm.
But it does seem, I suspect, that KV5 was the main burial place, not just of the sons, but also the daughters. It was instantly labeled as the king, as the tomb of the sons of Ramses II,
Hmm.
especially after this major discoveries were made in 19 mid 1990s. I want to say it was around 1994, 1995, including the discovery of some skeletal remains and decoration in the outer smaller chambers that depicted two of the eldest sons, Amenhotep Kopashev and Ramses Jr., a few canopic jar fragments that recorded Prince Seti, etc. But all the evidence that was coming out of the tomb mentioned only sons.
Hmm.
And again, only a handful of sons. But this tomb was gigantic with, over 100 rooms.
Hmm.
Again, we know the king didn't have 100 sons. On the one hand, there seemed to have been, even if you assume that some of these rooms were chapels and some of these rooms were, sarcophagus chambers, it still seemed, since there were more than 100 rooms, it still seemed more than perhaps was necessary for, the roughly 50 royal sons that we know of. But I think most importantly is the terminology the ancient Egyptians used.
Hmm.
They didn't call it the tomb of the sons of Usermatre Setepenre, Ramses' coronation name. It was known as the tomb of the Mesu Nesu, the
Hmm.
royal children of Usermatre Setepenre. And the royal children is a collective. Sometimes it's used specifically to refer to female relatives, but in this case, I think it refers to male and female children. And we also have to remember when we talk about the tombs of Ramses II's women in the Valley of the Queens, including again these daughters, there are only 5 tombs for Ramses II's daughters. In fact, there was even another tomb that he had excavated that was never used for any of his daughters, and then was finally occupied in the 20th dynasty. So again, we're only talking about a handful of these tombs. 5 for his daughter wives, 1 for his senior wife Nefertari, and 1 for his mother Queen Tuya. Even to say nothing of his other wives, were ever buried in these tombs that he that he built in the Valley of the Queens. So none of the other numerous, the 50 or so royal daughters ever got a tomb in the Valley of the Queens. So where were they buried? And why are there so many rooms in KB5 if we only have about 50 sons or less? And why is it called the tomb of the royal children of Ramses II instead of the tomb of the Sa Nesu, of the king's sons, if it's only for sons? And so to me, that all adds up to the idea that this is not just for boys. This tomb is for children of males and females.
Very good. Just out of curiosity, have you had a chance to visit KV5 yourself personally?
I was very fortunate on 2 occasions. One was actually in the mid 80s when Kent Weeks and his late wife were working there, and he gave us a tour of, and they were still digging in there. And I remember also seeing Mrs. Weeks as she was basically documenting some of the canopic jar fragments, and she showed us the fragment that actually had the name of Prince Seti on it. And then another time I was doing one of these high-end tours as the tour leader, or like what I like to call the pet Egyptologist. And it was one of these special access tours, and so we got to go in KB5 again. So it's quite something. Of course, there's very little decoration except for this outer chamber. The rest of it, the walls are completely scoured. There's not even a trace of plaster. If the rest of the tomb was in fact decorated, and even from what you can see of the small amount of plaster relief that's in the outer chamber, with a few traces of paint, what is left is exactly the same as the plaster decoration that is under the paint in the tomb of Nefertari. All of these would have been as spectacular, or nearly as spectacular, Nefertari. And I always like to say that Nefertari was very fortunate, not just in her an enviable position in the hierarchy of the royal family, but also just in how beautifully well preserved her tomb is. It really is almost like a miracle of preservation when you look at all these other tombs. But one can just imagine what KV5 must have looked like. Again, if you compare it to the very well preserved tombs of the 2 sons of Ramses III, Amenhotep and Montuhotep in the Valley of the Queens, and just imagine a gigantic version of that with all kinds of different sons and perhaps daughters of Ramses II, just covering acres of wall surface. I mean, it's just unbelievable what might have been there that is now completely destroyed.
The artisans must have been busy day in, day out for years. Well, Peter, that brings me to the end of my questions about the royal family of Ramesses II. As always, there's so much more we could have said, but if folks are interested, they can find your extended thoughts and discussions within Ramesses II, the ultimate pharaoh. Peter, thank you very much for joining us today. I hope you've enjoyed it once again.
Oh, yes.
And we look forward to speaking to you next time.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure.
My thanks once again to Professor Brand for speaking with the podcast. If you'd like to learn more about Ramesses' children, you can find an extended discussion in Peter's book, Ramesses II, Egypt's Ultimate Pharaoh, available now via Lockwood Press and all good retailers. And for those curious, here is a list of all the known children in order. They're organized by gender, starting with the sons. Number 1, Amun-Her-Kopeshev. 2, Ramesses, or Ramesses Jr. 3, Pa-Ra-Her-Wenemef. 4, Ka-Em-Waset, the famous one. 5, Montu-Her-Kopeshev. 6, Neb-En-Charu. 7, Meri-Amun. 8, Amun-Emwia. 9, Seti. 10, Setep-En-Ra. 11, Meri-Ra I. 12, Horus-Her-Wenemef. 13, Mer-Nep-Ptah. 14, Amun-Hotep. 15, It-Amun. 16, Meri-Atum. 17, Neb-En-Ta-Neb. 18, Meri-Ra II. 19, Amun-Em-Opet. 20, Sa-Nakht-En-Amun. 21, Ramesses Merem-Ra. 22, Jehutimes, or Tutmos. 23, Sa-Montu. 24, Montu-Em-Waset. 25, Sa-Amun, or Si-Amun. 26, Si-Ptah. 27, Ramesses Si-Atum. 28, Montu-En-Hekau. 29, Meri-Montu. 30, Ramesses Mer-Para. 31, Ramesses Merit-Mira. 32, Ramesses User-Kepesh. 33, Ramesses Meri-Sutek. 34, Ramesses Sa-Kepri. 35, Ramesses Meri-Ma'at. 36, Ramesses Meri-Astate. 37, Ramesses Ma-Hir-Anat. 38, Ramesses Sut-Em-Nacht. 39, Ramesses Gereg-Tawi. 40, Ramesses Shepses-Em-Iyunu. 41, Ramesses Astate-Her-Wenemef. 42, Ramesses Pa-It-Necher. 43, Ramesses Ma'at-Ptah. 44, Ramesses Neb-Weben. 45, Ramesses User-Pekti. And now the daughters. 1, Bint Anat. 2, Baket Mut. 3, Nefertari Jr. 4, Merit Amun. 5, Nebet Tawi. 6, Iset Nofret Jr. 7, Henut Tawi. 8, Werer or Werel. 9, Nejem Mut. 10, Ked Merut. 11, Nebet Iyunu. 12, Nebet Nuchet. 13, Toi. 14, Henut Ach. 15, Merit Sachmet. 16, Henut Iyunu. 17, unknown. 18, Nebu-Cher-Chebsed. 19, Shepsis-Cherites. 20, Henut Merut. 21, Merit Mihapi. 22, Merit Ites. 23, Nebu-Em-Iyunu. 24, Henut Pacher. 25, Henut Sekhemu. 26, Henut Isep. 27, Papoi. 28, Renpet Nofret. 29, Neferura. 30, Merit Netcher. 31, Merit Ptah. 32, something et Nofret. 33, something Chab. 34, something Ma'at. 35, something Yunes. 36, unknown. 37, something Meret. 38, something Mut. 39, unknown. 40, something Nofret. 41, something Ta-Weret. 42, Henut Ta-Neb. 43, Toya. 44. Chenut Shedesheret. 45. Chotepu Amun. 46. Nebet Yam Nejem. 47. Chenut Tatemu. 48. Nebet Ananash. 49. Sit Amun. 50. Tia Satra. 51. Toya Nebet Tawi. 52. Takat. 53. Nebu Wesket. 54. Chenut Mira. 55. Unnamed, but the daughter of Ma'at Hor-Neferura, the Hittite queen. 56. Iset, or Isis. Those names in the middle that were unknown or partial come from temples where we have the image of the princess, but the name itself is damaged or lost, so they seem to have existed, but they're not well recorded. Anyway, those are the 100 known children of Ramesses II, in order according to the monuments. Before I go, I'd like to extend special gratitude to my subscribers on Patreon. These fine folks help keep the show running and pay my bills, for which I am most grateful. I'd like to extend special thanks to the priests, my top-tier backers. My endless gratitude to these most generous folks. My thanks to Chris, Andy and Chelsea, Eric, Dan S., Veronica, James, Niden, Terry, TJ, Yola, Mycost, Jeffrey, Kate, Karen, Carlos, Erin, Alicia, Siyen, Andrew, Farron, Mallory, Dan B., Suyon, Erjan, and Linda. The priests are most generous, and I am in their debt. And I want to thank you for listening to the podcast. I'll see you soon.